Okay, it's 10:10, and I think we'll get started. Wanted to give people a few minutes to get logged on. I'm sorry for the Zoom issues. Uh, I Technology is not my strong suit, but we're trying. Thank you all for logging on. This is the Piedmont Winter Grains meeting. We would all prefer to be with you all in person, but this is kind of the best that we can do right now. So thank you for all your patience and for being willing to participate. This meeting will give you 2 hours of NDO and X credits. However, for the NCDA, I need you to have your camera on. And if you're on your cell phone and need to turn your camera on for that, all you do is tap your screen and you should have a little camera that lights up at the bottom and it just says start video. And then you should be able to, we should be able to see you then. And then we'll need you to get your license ready. Later on in the meeting, I'll ask for your license number, your name and your county for you to put that in the chat so we can log you for your credits. We also have a great lineup of our specialists speaking today. We're going to start out with Dr. Angela Post. She's our small grain specialist. Then we'll go down to Dr. Luke Gatiboni. He's our extension soil fertility specialist. Then we'll have Dr. Rachel Vann, our soybean specialist, and then we'll finish off with Dr. Wesley Everman, and he's our extension weed specialist. We'll take some time in between each speaker to give you some question time, and we also have door prizes we'll be giving out in between, or giving out. We'll tell you who gets them, and we'll get your information to mail them to you. And I also wanted to thank our sponsors for that, who are Pioneer with Stuart Turner, Corteva with Jesse Kalina, Tom Reddish with AgriGold and Concept Agritech, Liz Taylor with Morrow Insurance, and Jeremy Petrie with Foothills Crop Insurance. With all that said, I would like to hand it on over to Dr. Angela Post. Thank you for being here, Angela.
Thank you, Taylor. I'm going to share my screen and hope that it works wonderfully. Can you see that all right? Nothing yet?
I see you.
All right, perfect. So display settings, let's switch. So you're seeing just the PowerPoint and not the second slide? Thumbs up, something. Yep.
Just the PowerPoint.
Excellent. All right, so I'm going to speak today about mid-season management. There'll be a few things in here that you all have seen before because you've been to talks that I have given. And sorry if it looks like I'm looking off screen. I have 2 screens here and my camera doesn't always follow me properly. So I'm glad that so many of you could join us. And I want to start with the unfortunate news, and that is that we have been very wet all through the winter season. And this is basically our weather data from Rowan County. I present here Rowan County, even though many of you are in surrounding counties, because this is where our most local to you variety testing program trial is. And this is the weather data from October 1st through January the 5th. And we're showing max temperature, minimum temperature, and rainfall. And as you are all painfully aware, we have received approximately 14 inches of rain in your region since the start of wheat planting, or just before the start of wheat planting. We included the 2 weeks leading up to the season, just to kind of give you a sense for how much rain we had even just prior to that. Temperatures have been on the normal side, maybe a little above normal, but we have been steadily decreasing and have been in pretty good wheat growing conditions for temperatures, but we've been in very poor growing conditions as far as rainfall goes. So what does that look like in the field currently? The two, I hope these videos will play when I click them, but these two videos that I'm about to show are from Union County, so not too far away. They are another OVT that would be local to your region. And these are actually from yesterday. So it doesn't look like they want to play for me. If either way, we'll get a still image here. I don't know why they won't play. All right, well, we'll continue on. So here is, this is basically just a wet area in the field that has a little low depression, not necessarily land that would normally hold water, but anywhere we have little low areas in the field, we're getting complete saturation and even standing water. And then I'll show you kind of a farther out view of what the total field looks like. This was planted around the first week of November, and you can see any area where it was low lying. So where my pointer is kind of following, there's a low lying area. And then here we still have some standing water from the most recent rainfall. And in fact, as we were leaving this field yesterday, it was starting to rain again and rained overnight and will be raining into today. So kind of challenging outlook for wheat, even though we were able to get it planted on time in the state. We have higher than last year's acreage in most of the state, though there are a couple of regions where prevented planting occurred also. It's just going to be a struggle. We need some drying weather and some warm days to get this wheat back going again. So I wanted to spend some time talking a little bit about fertility. I won't steal your thunder there, Luke, but you've seen me give kind of this similar presentation before, and hopefully it will tie nicely into what you're going to speak about with soils. We always preach to apply starter fertility, and many of you have done that. However, all of that fertility is gone at this point. With 14 inches of rain in your region, you have no nitrogen left except those who applied litter. You obviously would have some tied up in the litter that hasn't broken down yet. If you had sulfur applied, or you typically have good sulfur ratios in your soil, then that sulfur is probably missing as well. So what we're looking at right now is that we need a mid to late January application, early split for most of our wheat in the state in order to keep it fed from now until we get to green up, because there's nothing left there to keep it fed. If we go back a little bit and look, you can see this field is still pretty green, and up close, it doesn't look terrible. I mean, I guess it does look terrible, but the coloration, the green coloration isn't too bad. But as soon as we start to have some warm days and it can pull from the soil, it's going to yellow up because we have no nitrogen there available for it. The reason that this field has remained green is you can see it's a pretty hefty corn crop previously, and 4.5 tons of litter was applied to this field. So there's quite a bit of litter history here. Anywhere where you don't have litter history, you're not going to have this green color even now. It'll already start to be looking pale and yellow. So my recommendation currently for pretty much across the state is if you can get 30 to 40 units of nitrogen, and in addition to sulfur applied as soon as we have field conditions conducive to being on that ground, then you should do that. So that's what we need to do, provide a fertile foundation. Here is an image from a previous year, and this would have been just after green up, what we are looking forward to and hoping that we will start to see with some drying conditions in this season. So where do we want to be? Where are we now? Where do we want to be? Just to give kind of an overview of what we're counting when we count tillers, here's a very small plant. We have the main shoot, and then we have a couple of tillers off to the side. These tillers are stems that have 3 leaves completely unfurled. I know in this time and temperature, we don't necessarily want to be out there slopping through our fields counting these, but it is important for us to understand what our yield potential is so that we can top dress to that yield potential and not miss out on any fall tillers that were created. So this particular plant is a small young plant with 3 tillers formed and the 4th tiller just about to start emerging. And you really want to go into your dormancy season with 3 fully formed fall tillers or more. And then as we move from this space toward green up, we really want to be at that 6 to 8 tiller mark when we're coming out and getting ready to start coming up off the ground and have that joint above the soil surface. So where does that look like on the growth stage? I keep trying to move this little box so that it's out of my way and I can see you guys. See, so here is our, I'm going to go back one. This is our wheat growth stage Zadox scale. And where are we right now? We want to be here about 3 to 4 tillers fully formed. And we're moving on towards this straight up and down line, which is our jointing line, which is where we should be sometime in late February, early March, if we don't end up with crazy warm temperatures in February like we have in the past. So basically you're in this period right here, and we'll, I've got an overlay here, but we're going to come back and take a look at that overlay in a little bit. So we'll keep going. So we've looked at how to assess what our tillers are looking like. Now, how do we assess jointing? That's going to be important because you want to be making your nitrogen application prior to this joint moving above the soil surface. And basically, in order to see that, you're going to need to split the stem in half and look for that emerging growing point. It's going to be a little green triangle usually, or a little round piece that's bright green compared to the rest of the stem. And it may or may not have some hollow stem behind it. Right now, it shouldn't have any hollow stem behind it. But as we move closer and closer to jointing, you'll start to see some hollow stem form behind that. And I have indicated here where the soil surface is and where that growing point is. So right now, completely protected. If we get freezes, if we get poor weather that might damage a growing point, that growing point is protected below the soil surface. And we'll look at, I think I have one more of those to show here in a, maybe I'm missing that one. Okay. It looks like I'm missing the next one of these. So I have one where I'm showing quite a bit of hollow stem behind this growing point. It looks very similar, but the growing point has moved closer to the soil surface and it's white behind that growing point. Once you start to see the white coloration form behind the growing point and you have a section of hollow stem behind that growing point, that's when you know you're approaching jointing. And once that reaches above the soil surface, we would consider it jointed. You want to have the greatest majority, if not all, of your nitrogen out on the wheat prior to reaching that jointing stage. We do have growers who don't follow that rule of thumb or aren't really necessarily sure how to go out and assess their field to see if the majority of it is at jointing. And we many times in North Carolina see those applications being made late. Now, making them late is better than not making them at all, but it does limit the amount of nitrogen uptake you're going to get into that plant because of the main timing when wheat is taking up nitrogen. And we'll talk about that when I finish going over the tillers. So these are all previous year images, but they are mid-January images. So typically the images I'm showing here will have been taken sometime between January 10th and January 20th. So basically right now in different parts of the state and kind of what those things look like up close. This field is one that has about 65 tillers per square foot, pretty much an excellent number to be sitting at right now. 50 to 70 tillers is a really good number to be sitting at right now. And I've seen many fields that are there, but again, they are very wet. The pictures I'm showing right now, again, not from this year, but also from a very wet year. So you'll see similar things to what you might be experiencing on your own farm or out in the landscape when you're driving around. This particular field just starting to lose its nitrogen and starting to abort the oldest tiller. So you can see the oldest leaves down in the canopy starting to turn yellow. This may be counterintuitive to some of you because you're like, well, we want our fall tillers. They're the ones that make the yield. We don't want to lose those. But a plant is a plant, and it's going to try and grow. And what that means is it's going to rob that nitrogen that's mobile inside the plant from the oldest leaves and the oldest tillers and try to form new tillers if it can't get that nitrogen from the soil. So that's why it's important to feed these plants. Here is one field that has a little bit higher tiller count, still a good number. We could still maintain this level of fall tillers going into green up, so 78 tillers per square foot. You can see the canopy is a little bit more closed. But again, some of those older leaves starting to yellow up and turn brown on the ends because we're pulling nitrogen from those tillers and moving it into the tillers that are now forming, moving on into the spring season. And then a field, I wanted to show at least one broadcast field. This is 89 tillers per square foot. You all don't have a ton of broadcast in your area, but if you have some fields that are broadcast, they may look more like this. And looking out across that field, you might not say, oh, that's 89 tillers per square foot compared to what these others looked like. But that's why it's important to get out there and count, because each wheat variety has its own plant structure, has its own way of kind of laying on that soil surface. And this particular one is a USG variety, and the tillers are just smaller overall. Even though those tillers are fully formed, it's just a different plant structure, and it looks thinner than some of, if I show you back 78, you might not say, well, this has more tillers, but it does when you get out there and count them. And that's why it's important, because we want to make sure I give this enough nitrogen and enough other fertility to save all of those tillers through the season so that I can make the best yield. And again, you can see this, it was a very wet season also, and I have seen many fields that look just exactly like this in 2020 and 2021, unfortunately. And then finally, to show you one that is over the top, okay, 143 tillers per square foot. While it looks beautiful, while it's a carpet, so it maybe even looks a little bit like the wheat that you see behind me in my virtual background here. I will say my virtual background is somewhere on over at the end of March. Do we want our wheat to look like this in the middle of January? It's pretty to drive by, but it's probably not sustainable. We're not going to make 143 bushels per acre, and many farmers equate, 1 tiller per square foot to 1 bushel. It's a rough estimate. It's not always accurate, but it's a rough estimate. We're not going to be making that here in North Carolina. That's our few and far between top of the line yield. So many of these tillers are going to abort. Why is that problematic? Well, we don't want to abort the oldest tillers. We want to keep the oldest ones and try not to make too many in the spring unless we've had a really tough season, and make our best yield with those fall tillers. So this grower has kept this one fed pretty well. You can just barely start to see some yellowing in the oldest leaves, but as we move towards green up, there's not going to be enough nitrogen there to support this. And if you added enough to support all of those tillers, what are you going to have happen? Probably that wheat's going to lay down. It's going to be more susceptible when we have storms of falling over, because it's going to have to grow so fast, and these tillers will be competing with one another rather than trying to do what they need to do. So that's just an overview of mid-January tiller counts during a wet season, what they can look like, in many cases what they should look like. Being in your region just yesterday, I seen a lot of poor looking wheat. I also seen a lot of decent looking wheat that I think can come on and make some really nice yields if we are to get some drying and warming days. And it looks like after this rain passes through us today that we're going to get 8 or 10 good dry days that will be welcome in our part of the state. Now I want to talk a little bit more about tillers and what they mean for yield. So here I'm showing you top 15 tillering varieties from one of our OVT sites and how many tillers per square foot they had at a mid-January timing. So I'm trying to showcase what is happening at this time of the year and what that can mean for you towards the end of the season. You may or may not have these particular varieties. A few of them have been pulled from the market, but many of them are still available, and many of them may be ones that you have out on your farm now. You can see that across the state, this is an average from the tiller counts from across the state. And you can see in mid-January, we were above the 50 mark for all of our top varieties, which is good. We want to be somewhere in that 50 to 70 mark. We had a few that were above the 70 mark. And then what does that equate to when we move into the grain fill season, and what does that mean for yield? So obviously these were all taken to yield. On the next slide, they are not in the same order. So if you have a favorite one, make sure you're looking at it from here and looking for it in the bottom. So let's just say Ag South Genetics 2033. We'll take a look at that one. It was the top tillering variety. We'll see what happened with it in yield. So these are final yields. So 2033 ended up right here in the middle at 88.1. So we were over the 70 tiller mark. We were able to maintain those tillers and come out with a really nice yield. Now, what happened here? We would have expected this yield to be up there with the rest of them. Some of you may have seen this slide before. So I'm going to go back and forth a couple of times so we can find out where these varieties are, because I've sorted this one by lowest to highest yield. So let's look for Ag South Genetics 2038 on the previous slide. Right here, middle of the pack, had just over 70 tillers per square foot at mid-January timing. If we were able to keep all of those, we should be above a 70 bushel yield for the season. So Ag South Genetics 2038, again, we didn't even maintain the 70. We hit a 62.2. Well, what happened? You're telling me, Dr. Post, if I make the application to my tiller count and I'm able to maintain those tillers, that I'm going to be able to make a great yield. But that's not the only factor that influences what your yield is going to be. In this particular year, we had a late spring freeze. That is very common for North Carolina, and that impacted our ability to maintain yield for the early maturing varieties. And Ag South Genetics 2038 is one of those varieties. So it got hit by the freeze. It's not that the tillers weren't there. It's just that many of those seed might have been blanked out. But you can see that many of these other varieties that were in the mid to late maturing situation, they made excellent yields after having that better than 50, somewhere between 50 and 70 tillers per square foot at that mid-January timing, and then providing the appropriate level of nitrogen to that. So how do we top dress to our tiller count? We've been training agents throughout the last 3 to 4 years on how to count tillers, what they're looking for, how to count in a broadcast situation versus a drilled situation. Basically, what you're trying to calculate is how many tillers do I have in a square foot so that I can equate that back to an acre basis and determine how many heads I might have here when it's time for grain fill. It's not going to be a perfect science. It's not going to be an exact number. It just gives you an idea, okay, how many bushels could I make here if I put enough nitrogen out there to fill all of the grains? So you want to scout your fields now to make sure you're in a good space. If you need to add tillers, for sure you want to get that early nitrogen split on now if you need to add tillers to get up to that 50 to 70 mark before green up. And then you can use those tiller counts to calculate your yield potential. You can also scout very close to your top dressing time, so you know exactly how many are out there and how many you need to feed. And we have a lot of tables available online, so you can find them that have different. I've just put one here. We're also working on one that will be more relevant to specifically varieties that we grow in North Carolina, which many times have less. You can see these are at 14,000 seeds per pound, 15,000 seeds per pound. That's kind of the top of the line for the number of seeds per pound that we see in North Carolina varieties for soft wheat. We generally are more like 12,500 to 13,500. So these numbers are just an example of what you would be doing. So heads per square foot, that's the same thing as your tillers per square foot, because each one of those tillers is hopefully going to make a head. So we wanted to be somewhere in that 50 to 70. So I'm going to give the top example here at 70 tillers per square foot. And I'm going to use the lowest seeds per pound because that's more realistic for a soft wheat. And then I'm going to take maybe the middle of the road for the number of seeds per head. Now, you're not going to know this number right here when you're out there counting right now. So it's good to just take either a low count or a middle of the road count so that you have a sense for where your yield range might be. I'm taking middle of the road and saying I'm expecting to make 24 seeds per head. And what that means at 70 tillers per square foot is that I have the potential to make 87 bushels of wheat with that particular yield estimation. So I want to make sure that I'm getting enough nitrogen out there to fill 87 bushels per wheat worth of grain. So that's kind of how I have been working with agents to take these estimations, and hopefully we'll have a table posted to the small grain portal here soon so that they can be out there boots on the ground and have something that they can use that's more relevant to our region rather than having to use ones from maybe Purdue or the Midwest, et cetera. Okay, so when we looked at this one time already, and I've already iterated that we need to have that nitrogen applied prior to jointing, which is this line right here. And you can see the nitrogen uptake curve and the timing. This is not a statistical chart or anything. It's just giving you a visual sense of when the main nitrogen uptake is occurring in wheat. And it is basically right now. So here's where we are right now, somewhere between 3 and 4 tillers per plant. And it's getting ready to start taking up nitrogen like mad. It needs nitrogen. That's why it will yellow up so quickly as we approach jointing in the spring. You've seen that before on your own farms and on your neighbors' farms. So make sure you're feeding it when it needs it. Because if you wait until that jointing mark, if you wait until here, that wheat has already taken up like 75% of the nitrogen that it's going to get to put inside its plant, okay? If you only have 25% more to take up and you apply a big slug out there after jointing, a portion of that is going to be lost or remain in the soil that, you know, maybe is going to be used in a following crop. But if you want it to be part of your wheat top dress, it really needs to be in this period right here rather than over here after we've seen jointing occur. Oh, here's the other image. I moved it to the wrong place. So here's the other image I was speaking about earlier. And you can see that hollow stem formed behind. This is about the size of a dime or a centimeter. Once you see that, that's when you know you're basically at jointing. And this first node, which is right here, would be above the soil surface. So just a refresher there. I'll have to move that before I post these to the website. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on herbicides here. I know Wes is on the program. Taylor, do you know if he's covering soybean or corn or wheat here?
I believe he's covering soybean.
Okay, so I will say a few words then, and then he can correct me if I'm wrong. So just listing some early post-emergent herbicide options. Some of these were a little bit past where you would be, for example, Zidua would have been very early, right at spike stage. But there are folks who come in a little later and make a second application if they didn't use up their annual limit to take care of ryegrass a little later in the season to take care of that second flush, giving us a little bit of residual. But I've also listed some of those broadleaf products that we have available. For example, as you start to see henbit and chickweed come on strong, you can use things like Culex or Harmony. And for me, personally, the earlier you can get in there and take care of that, the better, because these winter weeds are already starting to get quite large, maybe excepting bluegrass, which is just starting to emerge in areas where I have been around the state so far. If these are not exhaustive, this is not all the products you have available to you, make sure you consult the Ag Chem manual. And if you need a recommendation, make sure you're making that call to your agent or to one of the state specialists to help you with that. But again, the earlier the better. And in fact, if you have made a pre-emergent application, that is even better. check my time here, see where we are. Okay, I don't want to go too much farther. I don't have much left, Taylor, so hopefully we'll keep on time. Insecticides and fungicides. Not going to spend a lot of time here talking about this because fall and winter is not our best time. We will revisit these pest issues in the spring when they're a greater threat to yield and quality. And I really want to emphasize right now, there are going to be pests that come in, but you've really got to make sure your fertility is right first at this point in the season with the conditions that we've had. You have access to this online also, and in the Ag Chem manual. It is our fungicide table, and it gives you an idea of which of these products is best for controlling the different diseases we deal with. Certainly, we'll see powdery mildew come in first, and then we'll move into things like the rusts and scab a little later in the season. For mildew, gloom blotch, and the different rusts, we have lots of products that are good, very good, and excellent. It's when we move into head scab territory that we only have a few products available to us. So keep that in mind when you're choosing products that you're going to purchase for your farm if you ever deal with head scab, because you only have a few good options for control there. And then I want to finish out by reminding everyone the website for the wheat scab or fusarium risk assessment tool. It's wheatscab.psu.edu. You should be able to type that into your browser. And as we move towards mid-April, whenever we start to see heading and flowering, you can assess your risk. Generally, our risk is much higher for fusarium around the coastal region, but you all know that you see fusarium and Dawn in your area sometimes as well. We're going to skip protecting wheat in storage and wheat quality while waiting delivery, but also remind growers that as anything you have in storage that you need assessed for its market value for milling and baking, you can now send that to our grain quality analysis lab. There is a link on the small grains portal, and your agent can assist you in getting a sample sent into us. Samples that are sent in through a county agent from a farmer are currently free, and generally we turn those around in about 4 to 5 days depending on volume, and that will give you falling number, test weight, moisture, protein content, and Dawn level if it's above 0.5 parts per million. So that's my time, and on the next slide I will provide some contact information, and I'll be happy to take any questions if there's a minute or two.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Post. That's some good information. Does anybody have any questions for her while we built in a little time for questions? So comments, anybody?
Dr. Post, when we're counting tillers, how many areas of each acre should we scout and counting?
That's a good question. So typically I try to count, if I go to a field that's in your area, you have relatively kind of smaller fields until you get down into Union Anson. I try to just count 3 or 4 representative areas of a particular field. You can account for the acreage and go that way. I don't usually say, this many tiller counts per acre. Choose things that are representative. If you don't have things that are, or if you have really spotty fields, you might want to choose some that's in the heavier tillered areas and some that's in the really poorly tillering areas so that you can kind of average that. But basically, it's also going to depend on how the farmer treats that land. Is he going to be making a variable application? If he is, then that might be more important to split it up into smaller sections. If he's making one general application for the whole field, just counting 3 or 4 in a particular field and averaging those together is usually enough.
Thank you.
Good question. Anybody else have anything? Seth, have you got anything in the chat?
No, I don't see anything in the chat, John.
Okay.
Thanks, Angela.
Yep. Thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to Taylor then.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Angela, for that great talk and being willing to participate today. We're also going to give out some door prizes, and I was going to turn that over to either Mackenzie or Allison Brown.
Hey everyone. All right, so we'll get started with the giveaways. I'm Mackenzie Hall. I'm the livestock and field crops agent in Cabarrus. But I will get started on that. We're going to do about 6 at a time, and we have quite a few to give away. So if your name does get called, just please put your address in the chat box, and then we can get that stuff sent to you. All right. So the first winner of a Pioneer hat would be Jim Kaiser. Okay. The second winner of a Corteva hat is Matthew Cagle. Sorry guys, it's taking me so long. I have a little spinner going, so it takes a while for it to spin.
You're good. Thanks, Mackenzie.
Alrighty. The next one is Trevor Chatham, and he will be getting a Pioneer shirt. Now, Taylor, are those sized? Do we have specific size with those? If we
Let
need
me
to
check. I think I got larges.
put a certain size that they have.
Two large and two extra large.
If you could just please put, if you do get a shirt, just please put your size in there. And then for a Corteva shirt, would be James Ragsdale. And Daniel Miller is the next winner of another Pioneer hat. Josh Grant is the winner of a Corteva hat. And that is the first 6 that we will do.
Thank you, Mackenzie, and I appreciate the help. My area seems like cheaters. Most of them were from us. We're good luck, guys. So thank you. And then we'll just jump right into our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Luke Gatiboni. He is our Extension Soil Fertility Specialist. So Luke, you should be able to share your presentation and start when you are ready.
Okay, that's right. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, first of all, thank you for the invitation. And the presentation that I'm doing today is to answer this question about soil fertility. And I think everybody uses soil testing. And we have the recommendation of fertilizer that are coming together with the soil testing report. And the question is, are those recommendations of fertilizer adequate to our fields? Especially when we think about new varieties and the higher yields that you are achieving nowadays. And so maybe you have this question, are we applying enough nutrients for these fields? And this is the reason of the trials that I did in 2020 with soybeans, and I will show you some results about that. When you think about the fertilization, the amount of fertilizer that we need to apply to our fields, we have the total amount of nutrients that the plant needs to produce a certain amount, a certain yield. For example, here in this table, I have the amount of nutrients that we need to produce 50 bushels of soybean. And when you think about the soil fertility concepts, it's common to have these, we compare these with a barrel, and in this barrel we will put your grain, your yield, and each stave of this barrel is one nutrient. And if you have enough nutrient, you have a very long stave in your barrel, and if you have enough nutrient in the soil. But if you have a short stave, your yield will stop in that stave. And so when you think about the fertilization, the concept of fertilization, the fertilization is to apply the amount of nutrients that you are short in the soil. We have a certain amount in the soil, and if you need more, you just apply that amount to reach the maximum yield. This is the general concept of fertilization for crops. So the question is, when we receive a soil test report, for example, here is a soil test report from NCDA, we have this recommendation. In this case, we need to apply 30 units of P2O5 and 100 units of potassium, of K2O, and you don't need magnesium, sulfur, and other nutrients because you have enough in the soil. You just need to apply phosphorus and potassium. And the question is, are these 30 units and 100 units enough, adequate for our current yields? When you think about these recommendations, these amounts that you can see in your soil test report, the amount that I recommended is based on this kind of research, these trials. We make this trial applying increasing amounts of nutrients in the soil. You can see here the fertilizer rate is increasing. This is a trial, and you can see that the yields will be increasing when we increase the amount of fertilizer. But after a certain rate of fertilizer, you do not increase more the yields just because you have enough nutrient in the soil. After a certain rate of fertilizer, your soil is fertile, and you don't need to apply more fertilizer. If you apply more fertilizer, you don't have increasing yields. And when you transform this in profit, when you are applying fertilizer and you are increasing the yields, your profit is increasing. But after the best rate of fertilizer, if you keep applying fertilizer, your profit will decrease because you are using your money to buy and apply fertilizer, but you don't need that fertilizer. You don't have response of your crop to that fertilization. And so when we think about the rate of fertilizer that the rate of fertilizer that you are recommending is just to achieve the best profit of your yield. And of course, this best rate of fertilizer will depend on the soil type, it will depend on the variety, it will depend on the yield that you are expecting from your field. For phosphorus and potassium, in North Carolina, we use a critical level of 50. When you have your phosphorus index or potassium index in your soil test report, higher than 50, we don't have response to fertilization, and we don't need to apply too much fertilizer. When you have your phosphorus index or potassium index below 50s, we have response to fertilization. Of course, from 0 to 25, you have a higher response to fertilization, and from 25 to 50, the response is smaller, just because you are more close to the critical level, and the critical level for North Carolina is 50 for phosphorus and potassium. And you can see again in this example, the phosphorus index is 45, and the amount of P2O5 that we are applying is pretty small. The potassium index is pretty low, it's 18, and so the amount of fertilizer that we are applying is higher, just because we are short in potassium in this soil. And so to see if these recommendations, this rate of fertilizer that you are recommending are still adequate, we used 5 trials with soybeans in 2020. First, we used three long-term trials. We have one long-term trial in the Piedmont Research Station with 36 years old. We have another one in Peanut Belt Research Station with 39 years, and we have another one in Tidewater Research Station with 55 years old. In these long-term trials, we are using rates of fertilizers, rates of phosphorus and potassium, and you are calculating every year the best rate of fertilizer to apply, best rate of phosphorus and potassium. However, it's common, we have some concerns about the yield levels that you can have in some trials in research stations, because it's not exactly the same management that the farmer is using. And so we put 2 other trials in high yielding fields. We put a trial in a farm in Union County, and another trial in a farm in Beaufort County. And we choose fields that in the last years, the farmers are yielding more than 55 bushels per acre in these fields. And so they are very good fields. And we put trials in these 2 different fields. The management that we use in these 5 trials, 3 trials in research stations and 2 trials on farm, the management were exactly the same as the farmers are using: the soybean variety, the planting date, the seed rate, the row spacing, the weed management. And you can see here the variety that we use in our 5 sites and the planting date that we used in 2020. And in all these 5 sites, we tested rates of phosphorus and rates of potassium. And now I will show you the response, the results for phosphorus. Here we have the response of the yield to rates of phosphorus. Let me put this guy over here. Okay. We have the response in the research stations, Tidewater, Peanut Belt, and Piedmont. And you can see that we had response to phosphorus fertilization in these 3 sites. In Tidewater, the phosphorus index was 30, and we applied different amounts of phosphorus, of P2O5, and we increased the yields from the 20s up to 40 bushels per acre. In Peanut Belt, we started with 13, and we increased from 15 bushels per acre, and we increased up to 30 bushels per acre applying phosphorus. And in Piedmont, we started with index 6, and we increase in our yield was 35 and we increase up to 60 applying phosphorus. These are the two on-farm sites, and you have here the Beaufort County and Union County, and we start with phosphorus index 67, and we apply phosphorus, rates of phosphorus, and we didn't have any response to phosphorus fertilization. In Union County, we started with 44, and we didn't have a response to rates of phosphorus that we applied. And look at the yields that we had in these fields. In Beaufort County, in average, it was 62, 63 bushels per acre. In Union County, around 60 bushels per acre. And we didn't have response to phosphorus fertilization. Why we didn't have response? Just because our soil was fertile. The phosphorus index in the first case in Beaufort County was higher than 50. And in the second case in Union County, the phosphorus index was close to 50. And so when you are close or higher than 50, it probably don't have response to fertilization, even if you are having very high yields. When you put together all the sites, the 5 sites that we studied, and you transform the maximum yield of each site, we transform in 100% to put all the sites together in the same graph. We can see that for all sites, except for the Piedmont, for all other sites, we have increase of yield if your phosphorus is below 49. It's pretty close to 50, except for Piedmont. Piedmont, if you, in this special kind of soil in the research station of Piedmont Research Station, if you have more than 12 in the soil, you don't have response to fertilization. This is a very special kind of soil. This is a soil that can hold phosphorus and can release to plants phosphorus after that. And this Hawassi soil, we need to study more this soil, because in this special kind of soil, maybe you don't need to apply as much phosphorus that you apply in other soils, just because you have this phosphorus in the soil. But for other regions, other soils, 50 is it's a very good number for the critical levels. For potassium, in the same locations, and let's see in the research stations, in the Tidewater, Peanut Belt, and Piedmont, we start with potassium index of 35 in Tidewater, and we didn't have response to potassium. In Peanut Belt, we started with 24, and we didn't have response to potassium. And in Piedmont, we start with 31, and we had response to potassium from yielding 30 bushels per acre without potassium, and going up to 60 bushels per acre when we apply potassium. In the on-farm sites, Beaufort County and Union County, we started in Beaufort County with potassium index 40, and again, we didn't have response to potassium. We applied a lot of potassium, up to 200 pounds per acre, 200 units, and we produced, the yield was in average 70 bushels per acre, but no response to potassium fertilization. In Union County, we started with 24, and even with 24, we applied rates of potassium, and we didn't have response to potassium fertilization in this site. And we produced, the yield was 62, 63 bushels per acre. Again, putting all the sites together, the numbers are not so so good as for phosphorus. You can see some scattered points here, but it seems that if you have more in average for these 5 sites, if you have more than 39 or 40 of potassium index, you don't have response to potassium fertilization. So the takeaways of these 5 trials that we did in the last summer, the first thing, our trials in the research stations are yielding less than on farm, very good on farm sites. The long-term trials in the research stations, we yield from 30 to 60 bushels per acre, while in the high yielding on-farm sites, we yield 60 to 70 bushels per acre. In all the sites, in the research stations and in on-farm sites, if you have a phosphorus index or potassium index higher than 50, we didn't have any response to fertilization in those sites with higher than 50, sometimes less than 50 for potassium, and we didn't have response. It's interesting that we have that special soil of Piedmont that the critical level can be lower than 50. And I have a master student that is starting to work with these special soils, and maybe in the future we can build a different recommendation for those soils, applying less fertilizer, because we have this capacity of those soils to release some phosphorus for plants. And so I'm starting a master student to work specifically with the Piedmont soils regarding to phosphorus fertilization. And of course, this is 2020 was the first year of this that we got this data, and in 2021 we will have 4 new on-farm sites, and we still have the long-term trials in the research station, and plus we will have 4 more new sites to see if the recommendations are adequate. So if I need to answer that question just using 2020 data, and the question is, are the fertilizer recommendations adequate for the current soybean varieties and yield levels in North Carolina? I can tell you that yes, the recommendations are adequate. You don't need to apply more than the soil test reporting is asking you to apply for phosphorus and potassium. And if you are working in a high fertility soils, my advice would be keep your fertilizer into your storage building and not apply your fertilizer into the soil, because you can lose the fertilizer if you don't need it and you are applying the soil. You can have leaching of potassium, you can have phosphorus fixation, and so if you don't need that, just don't apply. You are losing money if you are applying this fertilizer. Well, this was my presentation, and here the people that help us in the last year, and I will be happy to take questions.
If there's any questions for Luke, just go ahead and unmute your microphone and ask them, or you can certainly type in the chat window if that's easier for you. Certainly, that's good work to know that that our index numbers are working. And if there's not any questions, we'll just turn it back over to Taylor so she can keep us moving forward with this program. Thank you, Luke.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luke. We appreciate it. And I'm actually going to turn it back over to Mackenzie.
All right, everyone. So I went ahead and spun the wheels and got everybody's name and what their prizes are, just so we can kind of stay on schedule, and I will read those off to you. Alrighty. So our first winner is James Scott Turner, and he got one AgriGold jacket. Then next is Nelson Dellinger, a Pioneer shirt. Robert Wyatt, one $50 gift card to Tractor Supply. Kathy Chatham got one shirt from Corteva. Larry Campbell got one hat from Corteva. And then Lawrence J. Siegel got one hat from Pioneer. And if you could, please, you can either private message or direct message me on chat with your address, or Marsha McGraw, or you can email us and we will put our emails in the chat, just so you won't have your address on the chat.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Next up, well, I think we can keep rolling here. Next up, we have, or for our speaker, we have Dr. Rachel Vann. She is our soybean specialist, and yes, I have you as co-host so you can share. Rachel, you can take it away.
Well, good morning, everyone. Glad to be here with you virtually. I'm going to get right into the presentation so we can stay on time. Today, I'm going to be discussing the keys to narrowing the North Carolina soybean yield gap. Based on a recent analysis we've done from 877 entries into the soybean yield contest over the past 18 years, coupled with our small plot data. So let's get right into it. First, I'm going to give the brief about what happened in North Carolina soybeans in 2020. Across much of the state, we started the season wet, early, lots of moisture in May. That resulted in a lot of soybeans getting replanted with soybeans, and soybeans getting planted into acres that were intended for cotton. Then we moved into a pretty moderate to good growing season across much of the state. And then we encountered some pretty severe seed quality issues in the coastal plain and parts of the Tidewater region moving into the latter part of the season. I think that the Piedmont was largely spared of some of these major seed quality issues. So because we started the season out so wet, seedling disease pressure was up in 2020. Corn earworm pressure was normal. Foliar disease pressure, especially late season Cercospora, was up in 2020. We saw higher than normal levels of stink bug pressure in soybeans. Green stem issues were increased, and nematode pressure was about average. So despite some of these challenges, they're still predicting that our average yields in 2020 are going to come in at 39 bushels per acre, which is about 4 bushels per acre above the 10-year average. Hopefully they'll solidify that estimate soon. Nonetheless, if you look at this figure, on the x-axis we have year, on the y-axis we've got yield. The orange line represents average North Carolina soybean yield, which sits around 35 bushels per acre. The green line represents average U.S. soybean yields, which are about 15 bushels per acre ahead of average North Carolina yields. And there's multiple reasons for that: soil type differences in rotational priorities. But what I want to highlight is, let's look at the blue line, which is the average yield in the North Carolina yield contest. And you can see that we have a very large gap between what we achieve in the state and average across our fields and what's attainable in our best fields when the best management practices are employed based on the results from our soybean yield contest. So one of the ways that we in NC State Extension and Research hope to help growers narrow the yield gap is by conducting research that will help you increase yields and hopefully ultimately profitability. You can see that the Red counties in this figure are where we had research in 2020. So we had a couple of Piedmont locations, and we addressed a variety of topics in our small plot research. So the data that's derived from this small plot research has some distinct advantages. It allows for controlled variability, and it also allows us to evaluate many different treatments. There's also value that can be gleaned from producer data, such as we derive from this yield contest analysis. And it helps both support and identify important differences in the results from our small plot data. So I mentioned already this analysis we did from 18 years of the soybean yield contest. And if you've entered or participated in the yield contest before, you know that we require the agent and grower to provide production information on the management that goes into that yield contest entry. And we've taken all of that data and tried to understand the production practices that have the biggest influence on soybean yield. So if you look at this figure here, we've got average county yield represented in these different shades of green, and these blue dots are density of entries into the yield contest overlaid across the state. So we had a little bit of less than a third of our entries come out of the Piedmont region in this analysis, but we can still make some robust conclusions from not only the statewide analysis, but the Piedmont analysis as well. So our objectives in conducting this analysis were to describe production practices associated with well-managed soybeans in North Carolina, understand how those have changed over time, and I won't discuss that today in the interest of time, and also identify management strategies that could be implemented by our broader grower base to help increase soybean yields in the state. So how did we analyze this data? When we get a yield contest entry, again, there's a bunch of different management information that's associated with those yields. And we looked at the following management factors and which of those had the biggest influence on yield. So maturity group, planting date, foliar fungicide use, row spacing, seeding rate, tillage, irrigation, herbicide applications, insecticide use, fungicide, and inoculant seed treatments. So that's the list of management factors we felt like we had robust enough data to look at their influences on yield. We did some traditional statistical analysis, and we also did what is called a conditional inference tree analysis. And I'm going to break that down momentarily in an extension format. But essentially, what this does is of those listed management factors, it looks for the ones that had the biggest influence on yield. And then it applies a binary split and looks for the next management factor that has the biggest influence on yield. So let's look at an extension style conditional inference tree. So if you look at the statewide tree where we looked at 877 entries, the largest predictor of soybean yield was maturity group, with maturity group 4 or less averaging 73 bushels per acre, and a maturity group greater than 4, so 5, 6, or 7, averaging 55 bushels per acre. And there was about 50% of the entries in each of those categories. The next strongest predictor of yield was the use of a foliar fungicide. It didn't matter if you were using an earlier maturing variety or a later maturing variety. The use of a foliar fungicide provided about a 10 bushel per acre yield advantage. And the third strongest predictor of yield when you were using an earlier maturing variety was using earlier planting dates. I just want to emphasize that as growers think about using earlier maturing varieties and planting them earlier, it's going to require a shift in mentality about how you manage your soybeans, and it's going to increase the need for crop protection programs. So again, the strongest predictor of yield in this analysis across the state was the use of earlier maturing varieties. What if we look at the Piedmont specifically, where we had 234 entries? Strongest predictor of yield in the Piedmont, again, was the use of an earlier maturing variety with a maturity group 4 or less providing considerable yield advantage over a maturity group 5, 6, 7, or 8. Within those categories, the next strongest predictor of yield was irrigation. As many of you who pay attention to the yield contest know, we have a couple growers that are very active in the Piedmont entering the contest with earlier maturing varieties that have irrigation. So that did show up as a strong predictor. When you were using a later maturing variety consistent with the statewide analysis, the use of a foliar fungicide was an important predictor of yield. And finally, if you're using an earlier maturing variety, again, earlier planting dates provided an increase in soybean yield. So the strongest predictor of yield in both the statewide and the Piedmont analysis was soybean maturity group, which were these latitudinal zones developed to say where a soybean genetic package best fits based on photo period or night length and temperature. If you look at the impact of maturity group in these 877 entries into the yield contest, on the x-axis we have our maturity groups, on the y-axis we have yield. We had very few entries from the maturity group 2 and 8 categories, so you can see we have quite a lot of variability there. But for the 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, and 7s, you can see as maturity group is delayed, yield declined. So that's data gleaned from producers that we analyzed in this yield contest data set. What about what we're learning from a small plot research perspective? In the soybean extension program, we have a graduate student, Mr. Tristan Morris, who's managing a large project looking at optimizing soybean yields through planting date maturity group combinations. The objectives I'll focus on today are the impacts of planting date maturity group on yield and soybean quality. In this study, we have research sites across the state, but we do have strong representation in the Piedmont with sites from Union, Yadkin, and Rowan over the past couple of years. We look at planting dates from mid-March through mid-July and maturity groups 2 through 7 late. Here's some pictures of the plots in 2020 taken across our research sites. These photos were taken in mid-August of the 2s through the 6s. We had very high yield potential at both the Beaufort and Rowan County sites. We lost a lot of our data from the Robeson County site due to some very excessive moisture in early September, causing some green stem issues, as well as very heavy stink bug pressure at that site. So let's look at some data from that trial. This is data combined over 2019 and 2020. So we have 8 sites feeding into this analysis. On the x-axis, we have our maturity groups. On the y-axis, we have yield. And I'm going to show you some different colored lines that represent our different planting dates. So this first one is if you're planting in mid-April, which is early for the vast majority of the growers in our state. And when you're planting early, we saw the highest yields with maturity group 4 and 5. Same situation if you were planting in late April. If you were planting in mid-May, again, we saw the highest yields with maturity group 4 and 5. When you pushed into late May, we actually saw the highest yields with maturity group 3. And then when we got into mid-June and mid-July, which are our double crop and late planted situations, growers have flexibility in using a maturity group 4 through 7. I often get calls, can I plant an indeterminate variety in a double crop situation? Well, our data from this trial from the past 2 years, as well as the OBT data, would say that when you get into a double crop or late planting situation, you have a lot of flexibility to plant a 4 through a 7, mid 4 through a 7. So to look at this data in a different way, if we look at our earliest planting dates, in 19, we saw the highest yields from a maturity group 4 and 5. In Beaufort County in 2020, it was a 3 and 4. And I will say we're picking up a trend that we're seeing slightly skewed advantages to earlier maturing varieties in the Tidewater region than the rest of the state. In Rowan in 2020, we saw 4s and 5s yield the highest. not only in our late March to mid-April situation, but also our late April to early May planting situation and our mid-May to late May planting situation. Again, when you got into the mid-June and mid-July planting situations, growers have flexibility in the maturity groups that they use based on this data. We're going to do this trial for 4 or 5 years and create a grower decision support tool where you'll plug in your desired planting date and it'll spit out the optimum maturity group and seeding rate to use at that planting date. If you think about just the differences in weather conditions in 2019 and 2020, in May, for example, last year, very hot and dry for 3 weeks in May. This year, very wet and cool for several weeks in May. It's obvious why we need to do this research over multiple years before we make very strong recommendations. Our limitation in the study is we're only testing one variety per maturity group. But if you look at our data from our official variety testing program, where we run soybean tests across the state each year, a couple locations in the Piedmont, this data is from 4 years. And in a full season situation, when we plant the beans in the middle of May, for the maturity group 4 class, where we're testing 60 to 70 varieties, it's a lot of varieties, they average 69.6 bushels per acre. Maturity group 5, 64.5 bushels per acre. 6, 61.9 bushels per acre. 7 and 8, 54.2 bushels per acre. So the same thing we're seeing in our small plot research and from the yield contest analysis, in a full season situation, we're seeing advantages of earlier maturing varieties. If you look at the data from the double crop OBT tests, which are planted in the middle of June, the maturity group 4s average 58, 5s 56, 6s 59, 7 and 8 52 bushels per acre. So now we're getting more comparable data to what we're seeing in our small plot data, where in a double crop situation, growers have flexibility with what maturity group is used. So what is the optimal soybean maturity group in North Carolina? This is a very complex question. It depends on your rotation. It depends on your ability to harvest timely, but both through our yield contest analysis and our small plot data in a full season situation, we're seeing advantages of planting earlier maturing varieties if you can successfully manage those in your operation. We have always and continue to recommend that our growers diversify risk by planting a range of maturity groups. So if you look at the statewide tree, the next strongest predictor of yield was the use of a foliar fungicide. It also showed up as an important predictor of yield in the Piedmont. So when you look at these 877 entries into the soybean yield contest, a foliar fungicide provided a 5.5 bushel per acre on average yield protection compared to where a foliar fungicide was not used. To look at small plot research from this topic out of the soybean extension program, Dr. Dunphy managed a trial for several years where we looked at various foliar products applied at R2, our full flowering to R3, which is beginning pod. And when you looked at these products combined over 19 environments, you can see fungicides on the x-axis, yield control or yield increase over the non-treated controls on the y-axis. And these fungicides provided anywhere from 1 to 3 bushel per acre yield protection on average over those 5 years. Typically, that yield production was more pronounced with a fungicide with a double mode of action. If you break that down by the individual environments, you can see that the benefit of a fungicide applied in early reproductive development was typically more pronounced in our high yield situations, which is consistent with what we are learning from that yield contest analysis. So what does that mean? Foliar diseases are often limiting yield in North Carolina's soybean production. This provides opportunity for enhanced management to protect not only yield, but quality. Foliar fungicides can play a role in protecting soybean quality. It should incentivize our growers to seek out varieties that have the disease resistance packages that are needed for some of these problematic foliar diseases, and also incentivize folks to think more deeply about robust foliar disease management. The final strongest predictor of yield in the statewide analysis was the use of earlier planting dates. That also showed up as important in the Piedmont analysis. And if you look at our soybean production guide, the optimum planting period has been historically defined as May 1 to June 10. We believe through this research, we're probably going to be able to move the cutoff for optimum earlier. We need a couple more years of research to do that. Dr. Dunphy would famously talk about you've planted your soybeans early enough if they've got tall enough to lap the middles. But with these earlier maturing varieties that we're producing in the state across different planting dates, there's a lot of scenarios where we can get the middles lapped in our soybeans. If you look at those 877 yield contest entries, there's this trend towards declining yield as planting date is delayed. If you look at our small plot research in 2019, we saw our highest yields when soybeans were planted from late April to late May. We actually saw a disadvantage of planting earlier than late April. And if y'all remember what happened in 19 during those 3 dry, hot weeks in May, our really early soybeans, many of them were already flowering during that period. And I think that led to some yield penalties. As you move into our 2020 data, we saw our highest yields at our earliest planting dates in Beaufort County. Yield declined as planting date was delayed. In Rowan County, we also saw our highest yields with the earliest planting dates. When you look at that data across 19 and 20, when you were planting in late March to mid-April, we saw average of 62 bushels per acre. Late April to early May, 66 bushels per acre. Mid-May to late May, 62 bushels per acre. And then yield declined when you planted in mid-June to mid-July. So this is a planting progress report for North Carolina provided by USDA NASS. And you can see here we've got data from the 5-year average 2019 and 2020. If you look at May 31st, you can see we typically only have about 55% of our soybean acres planted. Over the past couple of years, there's only been about 15 to 30% of our acres planted double crop, which means we still have a lot of full season soybeans that could be realizing yield benefits from earlier planting. I just like to highlight, when you're planting earlier than you historically have, you might see some different pest pressures. So this is an example from Beaufort County this year where we planted, our 3 earliest planting dates were April 6th, April 29, and May 26. And on our earliest planting date, we saw a lot of kudzu bug pressure that we didn't see in our later planting dates. We had to make an insecticide application because we exceeded threshold. And so that's just something to note. In 2019, we also saw higher levels of bean leaf beetle and kudzu bug pressure in our earliest planted soybeans. So you might have to modify your pest management strategies when you're planting earlier than you historically have. So as a recap, in this yield contest analysis, our strongest predictors of yield were maturity group, the use of an earlier maturing variety, 4 or less, providing yield advantages across the state and in the Piedmont, the use of a foliar fungicide, and the use of earlier planting dates. Now, there are practical limitations to all of these. If you're going to use an earlier maturing variety, you're going to have to commit to earlier harvest timing, probably more aggressive pest management than you've historically used in your soybeans, and you might encounter more green stem than you typically have, as we often see these issues more prevalently with indeterminate varieties. From a foliar fungicide use perspective, we see the biggest impacts of using foliar fungicides in high yield environments. It can be difficult to protect your yield environment. And also, just like with herbicides, we need to be cognizant of resistance management with our foliar fungicides. And for earlier planting dates, there can be some impacts of rotational complexity, and again, harvest timing on employing earlier than traditional planting dates. So in this analysis, what were some things that were not strong predictors of yield? Tillage. Growers were successful both in no-till and conventional till situations. Inoculant use was not a strong predictor of yield. Foliar insecticide use was not a strong predictor of yield. We believe the growers entering the yield contest scout their fields and make an insecticide application when necessary. And in these high yield situations, row spacing was not a strong predictor of yield. If you paid attention to our small plot data, usually we do pick up an advantage of narrow row spacing. But in these high yield environments where other optimum production practices are used, early planting dates, earlier maturing varieties that get a lot of vegetative growth, it didn't matter what row spacing you used. And that was consistent with some results from our colleagues up in the Midwest. So what are some conclusions? You know, this yield contest data set is obviously based on above average North Carolina soybean yields. However, our small plot research that we've discussed throughout this presentation captures a range of yield environments. So trends that hold true across the contest data set and our small plot research, that planting date is important, and typically we're seeing a yield advantage of planting before late May. Earlier maturing varieties can produce higher yields, but must be managed accordingly. And we again recommend our growers diversify risk by planting a range of maturity groups. And finally, foliar fungicides can protect yield in high yield environments, but we also recommend folks use host resistance as a robust mechanism of defense against foliar disease. I want to highlight an upcoming opportunity that we have as more of our growers in North Carolina and South Carolina think about producing these earlier maturing varieties. There are some important lessons we can learn from our colleagues out of the Mid-South who worked with their growers in this transition a decade or more ago. And so on February 8th, we'll be having a meeting where we'll have an entomologist, pathologist, crop physiologist, and soybean extension specialist out of the Mid-South. We've got Arkansas and Mississippi State talk about their top 3 considerations or pitfalls to avoid in producing these earlier maturing varieties. Your county agent has the details and will forward you those. We continue to push our information out on the soybean extension portal. Just this week, we released the yield contest results for 2020. So you can just Google NC State soybeans. This will be the first link that pops up. Myself and my colleagues were very active in creating field day videos this year, largely with the help of Jenny Carlio on the call today, our grain ASA in the South Central District. And we just hope that you will utilize these videos. They cover a wide range of production topics. You can get those on the soybean extension portal. And hopefully I stayed within my 20 to 25 minutes. I tried to give this presentation about an hour ago and I had an hour. So I know it was rolling pretty fast. And let me see, I see some questions in the or some activity in the chat. Oh, getting some questions about the internet. So hopefully the internet was okay for most folks. Any other soybean related questions?
Yes, Dr. Vann.
Hey, Brent.
Hey, what did you see as far as frost damage? I know here in the Piedmont we had a frost in early May. Did you have anything to say about that?
Thanks for the question, Brent. I think soybeans are pretty robust to frost compared to some of the other row crops we produce in this state, like corn, cotton, peanuts for sure. We didn't see any frost damage this year. They're most susceptible to frost when the unifoliate tissue is emerging out of the cotyledons. And, we didn't hit that timing, but even last year, Brent, when we planted in mid-March in Yadkin and Union, and a pretty, significant frost event laid down on those beans, they were able to come out and compensate. If the unifoliate tissue happens to die in a frost event, the soybean plant still has the capability to send off new tissue from that cotyledonary node. So in our very early planting situations have saw no negative ramifications of frost so far.
Thank you.
Has anybody else got any questions? You can unmute or type them in the chat. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Vann. We appreciate that. A lot of good information. Find a lot of that on the portal, I would say. So a lot of good information there as well. Thank you for that. We'll turn it over to, I guess, Mackenzie now for some more door prizes.
All righty. So for the next 6 winners, we have Frankie Singleton with a $100 Lowe's gift card provided by Morrow Insurance, Justin Atwood, a Pioneer shirt, Dennis Shadell with a $50 Tractor Supply gift card, Steve Dillon with a Corteva shirt, Alexander Yost with one AgriGold jacket, and then John Beaver with a $200 Concept Agritech credit on any product. And then we will give your information to the sales rep and they will be in contact. So if you could please provide, if you haven't done so already, your address or and contact information in the chat to any one of us or to the email or phone number we put in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Mackenzie, and thank you again, Rachel, for speaking with us today. Before we move to our last speaker, I see that a good amount of you are putting in your pesticide license numbers in the chat, but I wanted to remind you that that is how we're getting your credits to you. So if you haven't yet, please put your name, your county, and your pesticide license number so we can get that entered today. I'll enter those this afternoon. But our next speaker is Dr. Wes Everman. He is the one of our weed specialists at NC State. And I will let him share screen and start his presentation.
All right. It says I cannot share my screen.
Oh, really? I thought I made you a co-host. I apologize.
I see where I rank.
No offense, Wes.
None taken.
Okay.
There we go.
All right, cool. Perfect.
All right. Good to be on with everyone, and appreciate everybody getting on and checking stuff out, and hopefully get through this fairly quick. I always like to be the last one on before lunch because the big guy doesn't like missing lunch, and being late's just as bad. So I'll try to cruise on through mine and get us to lunch. So I want to talk about a few things with managing weeds and soybean. Got to start with pigweeds. You know, it's going to be our biggest challenge, what we're facing as far as resistance and, you know, getting out there, cleaning things up. And Palmer is at the top of the list, but I do want to keep raising awareness about common water hemp. This is a Midwestern cousin to Palmer amaranth. It's got a smooth stem, very similar to Palmer. So most of our other pigweeds have a hairy stem. You'll see hairs up and down on that stem. There'll be fine hairs and pretty easy to notice, you know, but here you can see how smooth this is. So Palmer, common water hemp are going to be similar in that regard. Where they're different is leaf shape and how they look. So water hemp is going to have a little bit longer leaf, a little bit thinner. Palmer amaranth is going to be more egg shaped, right? And then we often see this shiny surface to the water hemp as well that makes it a little bit different. Here is an example of one that we found out in the northeast part of the state. You can see how elongated that leaf is. There's no egg shape to it. It's going to just look different than Palmer. Often it's going to be a little bit smaller, not quite as big of a stem, not as aggressive of a growing plant. Often joke it's Palmer's wimpy cousin, but it's still a big issue for us and something we need to be concerned about. We've been noticing these populations pop up over the last few years. The first population we found was up here in the northeast where this small yellow circle is, but we have found several populations in the upper Piedmont, Forsyth, Davie County, and that area. Now, what we're seeing with this, in the Midwest, there's a lot of resistance with this water hemp. So there's ALS, glyphosate, PPO, HPPD, trizine. Even up there in the Midwest, they're finding water hemp that's resistant to 2,4-D, prowl, among other things, right? So we tested these populations, especially those in the upper Piedmont, and what we're finding is ALS and glyphosate resistance across the board. And then we had populations that were PPO resistant, HPPD resistant, and trizine resistant. So we have some that can survive 4 different modes of action. What's concerning about this, these are all brought in on equipment from the Midwest. So when folks are going out to these auctions or picking up, used equipment at a good price, if it's coming from Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, there's a good chance you could be bringing in something like this common water hemp that's resistant to multiple modes of action. So you could be doing everything right on your farm, and just by getting some new equipment or new to you, end up with an issue that is just a nightmare to manage. I say that not to discourage you from getting that equipment, but make sure you clean it out well. Make sure you're going through it with, pressure washer, blowing it through the air through it all. If it's a combine, just try to clean it up as much as you can, to avoid having problems. The black circles are where we seen the PPO resistant Palmer amaranth. It's still very spotty. It's not widespread, which is a good thing, but it is occurring and we are starting to see more of it. To manage this resistance, whether it's the water hemp, the Palmer, some of the other resistant weeds we have, we need to be using multiple modes of action. We've been preaching this for 10, 15 years now, right? But what we're seeing is, as we're picking up PPO resistance, as we're seeing some of these other resistances come in, we're losing the number of different products that we can put out. So we want to use these group 15 herbicides, the Dual, Warrant, Harness, Zidua, Outlook. Those products are going to give us good control of especially the pigweeds. Group 14, the PPO inhibitors still have a place as a product for control. Now, I'm talking about these as a right? Valor, Spartan, Reflex put down up front are going to give us a good foundation to come back and clean up later on. And then the group 5s, you guys should be good most of the time to use metribuzin. That clay soil is going to be a lot more forgiving than the folks that are in the coastal plain on the sandy soils, but still be aware that you want to plant those beans, about a 3/4 to an inch deep, if not a little deeper, if the moisture is there for it. And then, make sure you're using a variety that is tolerant to metribuzin. We have some pretty good lists. We're actually doing a screen of those in the greenhouse as well that hopefully get put on the OVT site also. Then make sure we're rotating those post chemistries. We don't want to basically pick a chemistry and ride it till it dies. Okay. If you're using Liberty this year, consider using Extend or Enlist next year. Try to rotate these traits. Now we have the, in Enlist beans, we're going to have Liberty Link, 2,4-D, and Roundup tolerance. And then in Extend, we're going to have Dicamba, Liberty Link, as well as Roundup Ready. Those are the Extendamax, beans. So there's options for us to use multiple chemistries in a year. So make sure you're understanding what is in the beans you're choosing and how you can rotate those post products. It's a little confusing, so I have a table put together here to hopefully help. Here's the different herbicides we can spray over the top. across the top of this table. Down the side are the different names or types of beans. Conventional beans, obviously we can't spray any of these over the top. You'll kill them. Roundup Ready 2, we're looking at glyphosate only. Liberty Link is Liberty only. Now we start getting into the stacks and it can be a little bit confusing. So make sure you're paying attention as you look at stuff, because we're going to have the Roundup Ready 2 Extend that have Roundup and dicamba tolerance. Down here at the bottom, we're going to have Extend Flex that has tolerance to Roundup, Liberty, and dicamba. Don't confuse the two and then try to spray Liberty over the top of the Roundup Ready 2 Extends, because you'll have issues. Enlist E3, glyphosate, Liberty, and 2,4-D we can put over the top. GT27s are going to be glyphosate tolerance. That's the GT. 27 is the HPPD tolerance over the top. And then LLGT 27s, you're going to be able to do glyphosate, Liberty, as well as the HPPD. So we have some good options. We have some different modes of action. Most of them are going to be glyphosate and Liberty, and then the different options stacked in. So just be aware, we're not going to be able to spray one over the other. Can't spray dicamba over Enlist or the GTLLs, and vice versa. So make sure you know what you got. Make sure you're making the right application and rotate them. To set up right, we want that strong Valor or Metribuzin with the group 15. Most of that Palmer Amaranth, the water hemp, they're resistant to the ALS inhibitors, so those are out the window. So be aware, we may see other weeds come along that become an issue. And like I said, those PPO inhibitors still work in most of our areas. Be wise, be timely. Now, the other piece I want to talk about, since I'm stressing using these pre-herbicides so much, a lot of folks over these last couple of years with the seed quality issues and some of the seedling emergence and seedling death issues have started questioning herbicide injury. And I want to talk about it a bit because it is happening. We do see it some. We can have stunted plants. We can have deformed leaves. There can, even in bad cases, stand loss and leading ultimately to yield loss, right? So as we look at it, why is this happening? Now, there's a couple different primary reasons that are overarching. One is rate. That can be due to the sprayer overlaps or sprayer, missprays. Soil movement. We can have some erosion that moves soil. It can also be the environment, right? We could have cool weather, excess moisture. We've seen a lot of these springs these last few years, right, where it's cool and wet. So we have both cool weather and excess moisture. You look at these different symptoms and they're probably ones you've seen. Generally, our plants outgrow them, and they're actually things that are fairly common. Through the Roundup Ready years, we got away from a lot of the pre-emergence herbicides. We got away from seeing this type of injury. This is leaf distortion by chlorimiron. This is classic. It's common to see this, right? You got a little bit of puckering and those leaves are distorted. They're a little bit folded up. We'll often see stacked nodes from the ALS inhibitors here. You can see those nodes are all stacked up. These are shorter than those that are not. Well, this is chlorsulfuron and metsulfuron carryover from finesse, but still ALS symptoms where you have stunted plants. You can even have chlorocetamide injury. These are the group 15s, right? So your dual, warrant, harness, Zidua, outlook. This is corn, but still, to show this is a labeled application. This isn't an off rate. This wasn't sprayed wrong. It wasn't sprayed on the wrong crop. It's not drift. This is just buggy whipping, what we call it in corn, right? So those leaves don't unfurl correctly and it causes injury. The group 15s on soybean will give you a drawstring effect, give you some heart-shaped leaves, especially on the first trifoliate. It looks like somebody pulled that mid vein down at the bottom, gave it a tug, and drew it in a drawstring at the top, right? It can also look very similar. If you look at these here, right, they look very similar to dicamba injury, right? A little bit cupped, a little bit pulled in on the margins. This is common to see, especially under the right environmental conditions or at high rates. In really bad situations, we can even see some very severe stunting or stand loss, but this has to be exceptional issues. This, in fact, is cotton. So we generally don't see this in soybean, but we can overdo it with the rate depending on the product. If we put it out post-emergence, we can see some leaf distortion. You can see that what, again, looks like 2,4-D or dicamba injury just from applying a chlorocetamide. Metribuzin, I mentioned it. We can have anything from dead plants to knocking a few leaves off, some interveinal chlorosis. You can see these dead leaves here, the necrosis. There's a whole range of symptoms from the metribuzin. Again, it's rate dependent. It's dependent on tolerance as well as environment. All play a role. Protox inhibitors, the PPOs. This is Valor, flumioxazin. You get the right timing of rainfall. You get a little bit extra pushed on top of that plant as it's coming out of the ground. So you can see here, look at that soil, right? There's a pretty good driving rain going on. It looks like heavy rain, a lot of splash, maybe even washed it right into the furrow as it is coming through, and you got injury on that growing point. Now, I'm not trying to scare you off of the pre's. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to show you these things happen. It isn't anything really super out of the ordinary. Generally, they come out of it. But the environment plays a big role, okay? Cool, wet weather slows down our plant growth. It slows the metabolism. That plant isn't able to break down that herbicide like it normally can, so you get a greater response to that herbicide. Generally, as the weather warms up and improves, that growth returns, the metabolism returns, it breaks down those herbicides, and it outgrows that injury, and we don't see it for the rest of the season. And the majority of the time, a significant majority of the time, soybean will outgrow it, and we won't see any significant stand loss or yield loss in the long run. Now, you may say, I don't like seeing it. It makes my stomach sick. I don't feel good. How can I minimize it? Avoid application immediately before a significant rainfall is a big one with these residual herbicides, the pre's, right? It reduces the chance of erosion. It can't all collect in one part of the field. It also reduces herbicide leaching into the root zone. It doesn't wash it right into that furrow, into the roots where the plant takes up a big chunk of it at once and has to try to metabolize, a higher dose. Biggest thing with this, I can't stress this enough, do not cut the herbicide rate. A lot of people have messaged me and said, look, I'm seeing injury from these pre-herbicides. What if I cut the rate back so I don't see the injury on my crop? If you reduce the rate, you will reduce the injury. So there is some logic behind this, but we don't want to do that. Even though it'll reduce crop injury, it'll also reduce the herbicide dose in the weeds. And why are we even putting that herbicide out there, right? It's to protect those post-emergence herbicide options that we're losing one by one, year after year, okay? If we reduce the rate, we reduce the dose, and you increase the potential chance of survival of those weeds, results in a creep towards resistance. We're using these as a resistance management tool. Reducing that rate isn't going to help us in that cause. It's actually going to create bigger issues for us. We'll probably lead ourselves towards more resistance to these residual herbicides and fewer options for us as far as herbicides go. All right, the very last thing I want to talk about a bit is some research we're doing on drought stress or moisture stress. We built these moisture gradient tanks, okay? And they're 4x8 box. That's the footprint here, 4 foot wide, 8 foot long. They're about 2 foot in the front and about 6 foot in the back. What we do is we fill them in the bottom with gravel and sand, and we have a standpipe along the back that allows us to sub-irrigate. We put field soil in all the rest of this. Plant our plants up top, and what you get is this moisture gradient. And you can see there's a capillary fringe in this soil that allows these plants to be at excess moisture or field capacity, and then varying degrees of drought stress as we go up through this tank. Now you can see this moisture just pulled up to the top here in this soil, no plants in there. What we do is we plant 2 sides of this with different species or combinations, and we did soybeans with palmer or crabgrass. So if you're here, for example, you can see soybean on the left and soybean with crabgrass. There's one sticking out down here on the right. And what we did is we allowed them to grow. We irrigated them a little bit on the top. Then we turned off the water when those soybeans reached V3, allowed them to compete with the weeds for 3 weeks, and then dug them up and did all kinds of different measurements on them, right? Heights, weights, leaf number, roots, all that. Now, not going to get into all those details for time, but some of the things that really stood out. Now, height was an interesting one, okay? Soybean is the open circle. As the moisture stress increased, okay, so the way this is set up, that box is going from left to right, more drought stress as we go to the right, same down here. As that row number goes up, the further up that gradient tank it goes, the greater the drought stress. The heights got shorter, right? You had shorter soybeans as you had greater drought stress. You add in large crabgrass competition, that's the black circle. Very similar, not much different, maybe a little bit shorter plants as we had drought stress. So again, not really surprising, but this one was surprising. This open triangle here is where soybean competed with Palmer amaranth. And across the board, the soybean were taller. Now we still had a trend towards shorter plants under drought stress, but all of them were taller growing with Palmer amaranth. And this is why. That Palmer amaranth just took off, and those soybean were trying to compete. And it was just a constant struggle for them to get taller and get more light. In the end, when we look at shoot dry biomass, when they were grown alone, no competition, we had the most biomass, which, you know, in the end is going to be best, right? Where we had Palmer amaranth growing, there wasn't much difference, but they were really tall, thin plants. So they weren't the healthiest looking. What was interesting, even though we didn't see big height differences, we saw significant biomass reduction where it was grown in competition with just one crabgrass plant. And you think how little we think about that crabgrass, and those are hundreds per square foot generally, not just 1-to-1 competition. Now this Palmer amaranth, I want to point out a couple things real quick. First of all, we didn't really put moisture stress on it. This thing just took off. Look how tall these plants are. This is the grad student that worked on the project. He's about 6 foot tall, a little bit taller than him. Those roots look more like carrots than Palmer amaranth. And this is the tanks in the greenhouse. You can see they actually overgrew. They overtook the lights in there. They just took off. The only thing that was significant was root length. So down here where that box is shallow and there's water right close near the surface, had the shortest roots. As we went up this box, the roots got longer. Those roots all made it down to that water line. They all were very competitive. Actually, the Palmer amaranth root length was shortest where there was no competition. So where there was soybean or large crabgrass, the root was the same length, but longer than when they were grown alone. So this is all new. We're just starting to get into this, but what I want to point out, the Palmer amaranth knows that it's competing with these other plants, and it partitions its growth into height and roots at a faster pace to outcompete whatever it's growing with. So the biggest thing I can stress, we need to get these early before they get some size and they do a lot of damage. Here you can see again that row 1 where it was shallow, those shallow roots. Look how long these roots get as we get deeper in the box, as we get further up. Just phenomenal growth on it. But we want to be getting out there timely, controlling these weeds before they get too big and have a big impact. And even regardless of weather, right? So even under drought stress, that palmer was able to get down to that capillary fringe, that water table, and utilize that water to outcompete our soybean. And so oftentimes we would say, well, if it's hot and dry, the plants aren't growing. That may not be true with palmer. Now we got to do more work, but gosh, I want you guys to be thinking about that. We might want to try to knock those palmer out so it's not competing through a droughty time with those soybean. Anyway, that's that. Like I said, I don't like being late for lunch, so I tried to hustle. Thank you all for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions.
If there's any questions for Wes, feel free to type them in the chat or just go ahead and unmute yourself. And that's some pretty interesting research with that palmer taking over.
Wes, I had a question for you.
Sure.
I was wondering, we know the chlorocetamines have issues when we're replanting cotton. I was wondering if y'all had looked at any replanting considerations with Warren or Zidua or Anthoflex, Anthamax Pre.
On soybean?
Yeah, replanting to soybean.
We shouldn't have issues with those replanting the soybean. We've done work as they were coming to the market with different timings, pre-plant or different rates pre, and generally we didn't see a big issue. I would say something to be aware of maybe with the warrant, and I'll say up front, we didn't.
Wes, you're muted right now, Wes.
All right, well that's good. I was been talking and talking. I don't know how I got muted. Sorry. Well, now I'll shrink down my answer. With we don't see an issue with replant with the chlorocetamines. Generally, we test them as they come to the market, looking at different rate response. The only one I'd be concerned of would be warrant. And I say that because once it starts breaking down from that encapsulation, you can have issues with your soybeans. So that one I'd be a little cautious, but unless you had a high rate, it shouldn't have a long-term impact. And the longer you have from when you applied it, and if you had, I'm assuming if you're having to replant from cotton or if you're replant from corn and use warrant, we're probably replanting because of water, and it should have broken down, and acetochlor moves fairly well once it's broken down. So it shouldn't be a big issue, but that'd be the only one to even think about.
Good deal. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Dr. Everman, can you speak to metribuzin rates for just a second that you've seen in soybeans? Do you have a threshold or anything like that?
Yeah. As far as so in the metribuzin, the best advice I can give is use the rates that are on the label for your soil type. We've done a good bit of work on different soil types. We can adjust the rates up or down to get better control, but where those rates are on the label are where you're going to see soybean safety. And if you get going low, if you play around low, oftentimes we see a loss in weed control. So just hit what's on the label for your different soil type and you should be good to go.
Well, if there's not any other questions, we'll turn it back over to Taylor Dill.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you, Wes. And one more time, I'm going to turn it over to Mackenzie for some more door prizes.
Alrighty, here is the last ones that I have, and then we will finish off with our big giveaway, and then Marsha will be giving that away. Just a reminder, if you have not sent us your address, please do so we can get these sent to you. And I will continue with the last little bit. All right, so our first giveaway is going to Brianne Reeves with one AgriGold jacket, Wayne King with a $50 Tractor Supply gift card, Andrew Blythe with one Pioneer shirt, Mark Green with a $100 gift card to Lowe's, Jack Neal Sisms Jr. with a Corteva hat, and then Jimmy Tucker with a Pioneer hat. All right. And if we will be going through the list, and if there are names that we have called and they are not on the Zoom, we will be doing a few giveaways. So be sure to get your addresses in so we can make sure you get your giveaway. Thank you.
And then Marsha for the last big giveaway, you want to handle that?
I don't have it.
You don't have it?
Mm-mm. I don't even know what it is.
You don't know what it is? Oh, okay. Well, I'll cover it. So AgriGold wanted to give a half of bin of Extend Flex beans to a farmer, and the half bin, you would get a half bin for free, but you would have to pay for the other half bin. So we didn't want to just give it to somebody and make you owe AgriGold half of a bin. So if you are interested in receiving that prize of a half of a bin that you pay the other half for the new Extend Flex beans, Marsha, can you be the call person for that?
Yes.
If you would call or text.
They can call the office. My number is up there. I can put it back in here again too.
Okay. So Marsha's going to put her office number in the chat, and basically whoever reaches her first will get the opportunity to try the Extend Flex beans out. And that is the giveaway that Tom Reddish with AgriGold wanted to do. But with that, I think that's the last giveaway.
Will you just say your number out loud in case people don't have their chat up?
Yes, I can. The number to reach me is 336-753-6100. And my name is Marsha.
Thank you, Marsha.
You're welcome.
Before we end the call, I just wanted to remind you to get your pesticide license number to me or to the chat. Most of you have, I think, but just as a reminder, if you haven't yet, we need those. And thank you all for your patience and for staying on the call. And we really appreciate you coming on. And thank you to all of our speakers and all of our agents on here that put it together. I'm going to stay on for a little while just in case people have more questions or need anything else. But thank you all for your time.
Hey, Taylor, I see that we've got Mr. Dellinger on here. Do you want to announce anything from the soybean yield contest?
Oh, yeah. So Nelson Dellinger, he is a farmer in Cleveland County, and he was a top yielder in the soybean yield contest for just the Piedmont, right? Or the Southern Piedmont?
The Southern Piedmont, yep.
So his yield was 84 bushels, and I helped him cut that yield plot. So congratulations to Nelson. And if in the future any of you want to participate in the yield contest, please let me know, and we can get you entered next year.
Thank you, Taylor.
Thank you, Nelson.
Taylor, you should be able to stop recording now.
Okay, that's a good idea. I kind of forgot about it.
Yeah, don't end it just yet. I'm trying to get all the addresses out of the chat.
Oh yeah, no, I got you. We'll keep it on.
You can save the chat, Mackenzie.
Oh yeah, I can do that. I forgot.
I almost always copy and paste the chat to myself and email it to myself too, just so we have like a lot of. I had some people text and email me their addresses too.
Okay, and I can send. I have a big list here. I can send it to you.
Okay, perfect. Do you want me to tell you which guys specifically sent them straight to me?
Just email them, or you can text them. You can text. Do you have my cell?
I don't, but I can. If you would give it to me, I'll text it to you if you prefer.
It's 336 596 1010.
10. Perfect. Let's see.
Do we need to quit being live on YouTube too?
Oh, yeah.
I just realized that now.